So in this video, we're going to talk about how to work with static inventories in Ansible. So before we can get to work writing a playbook in Ansible, we really need an inventory that we can work off of. And when we create a static inventory, we're just going to use a static file, basically. Now, you can use a number of different file extensions and formats, but for this video, we're going to write it in Yaml. So for the video, I'm going to be working in the static inventories directory. You can see I have it open in my terminal down below. And to get started, we'll go ahead and create our inventory. We'll just call it inventory.yaml. Alright, so we'll start off with 3 dashes. And then at the root level, the inventory has to specify groups. So what we're going to do in our inventory is we're going to create one group with 4 hosts. We're going to have 2 routers and 2 switches. And then we're just going to call this group all. So how we're going to do that is we're just going to say all, colon, and then we're going to hit enter and then indent in one level. And now we can specify the settings for the all group. So each group in an Ansible inventory can have 3 things. We can have hosts, we can have variables, and we can have child groups or nested groups. In this case, we're just going to have 4 hosts that are directly tied to that all group. So we're just going to say hosts. And then each host in this group is going to be a key in this dictionary. So we'll go ahead and make a few hosts. We'll say router 1, router 2, and then a couple switches as well. And I know it looks a little odd to see a key without a value, but this is actually a valid Ansible inventory. And we can go ahead and test that out with our playbook. So if we go look at the example.yaml, this is a playbook that I've already created for the video. And if you haven't seen or written playbooks before, I'll go ahead and explain a couple basic things here. First off, a playbook is just a list of plays. And in this playbook, this whole chunk of code is one play. And then within the play, we can see we have a name for the play. We have the hosts that we want to target. And the value that we put here has to be a group name or a host name from our inventory. So in this case, we're just saying that we want to run this play against the all group. And then gather facts. We're not going to cover that in this video, but normally you're going to set that to false. And then the connection type. So in this playbook, we're not actually reaching out to end devices, so we're just going to set the connection type to local. And down below these basic settings, we have a task list. And then basically, we only have one task set up. The name of the task is called debug variable, and then we're calling on the Ansible debug module. Now the whole purpose of the Ansible debug module is simply to print out variables or custom messages to the terminal when we run a playbook. In this case, we just want to print out a variable, and the name of that variable is inventory hostname. So inventory hostname is what's known as a special variable, also called a magic variable. So basically the concept behind a special variable is that they are created by Ansible for you, right? We don't have to manually define special variables. And in the case of inventory hostname, it's exactly what it sounds like. When we run this task against every group, or excuse me, every device in the all group, for each one of those devices, this task will print out the inventory hostname of that device. So that being said, we'll go ahead and run our playbook, and we're going to use the Ansible playbook command. So it's going to look like this. Ansible playbook, and then the name of our playbook, so example.yaml. And then we're going to pass the I flag so we can specify our inventory file, and then we'll say inventory.yaml. And then we hit enter, and we'll just kind of take a look at the results here. But you can see we have the name of our play, the name of our task, and then we ran that task for each device. And in this case, we had 4 devices in our all group, so we ran this task against all 4 of those devices. And then for each device, you can see that it correctly outputted the inventory host name. So router 2, router 1, switch 2. So now let's say that we wanted to assign some host level variables to each one of these devices. Let's go ahead and do that in our inventory. So what that's going to look like is underneath each device is where we can input the host level variables for that particular device. So let's say that for router 1, we want to give it a variable called management interface. And for routers, we want this to be set to loopback 0. So we'll go ahead and do the same thing for router 2. And then let's say for switches, we want that management interface variable to be set to VLAN 1000. So we'll do it like this. Cool. So now let's go back to our playbook, and instead of debugging the inventory host name variable, let's debug that management interface variable that we just created. Then we can go ahead and run our playbook again. And as you can see, we got what we expected. The two routers have a value of loopback 0, and the two switches have a value of VLAN 1000. And so that works fine, but what if we had 1,000 devices in our inventory? We don't want to go through and set this management interface variable for each and every device, right? So this is where group level variables really come into play. So what we're going to do next is we're actually going to create a group for each of our routers, and then another group for each of our switches. And then we're going to apply the management interface variable at the group level instead of at the host level. So how we're going to do that is first, let's go ahead and get rid of this hosts key. I'll hit enter a couple times. So again, we're going to do some work on the all group. So again, groups can only have three things. We can have hosts, we can have variables, or we can have child groups, which are also called nested groups. In this case, we want to create a group for the routers and a group for switches, and we want these two groups to be children of the all group. So what we're going to do is, underneath all, we're going to say children, and enter indent in one level, and then the child groups that we want to go ahead and define. So we're going to say routers and switches. And now these are they're just nested groups. So again, we can have three things for each group. We can have hosts, variables, or child groups. Now, what we're going to have for each one of these groups is we're going to have the associated hosts as well as the variables that we want to set, which in this case is just the management interface variable. So starting off with routers, let's go ahead and let's create our hosts. So we'll say hosts, and then we can just copy and paste the two routers. That didn't work out very well. And we'll do the same thing for switches. So hosts. And then we can go ahead and just tab that out. Cool. So now we really haven't changed the way our inventory works so much. We've moved each of our devices into a different group, right? But we're still applying this management interface variable at the host level, which is going to be inefficient. It's going to make our inventory longer, and it's going to give us more overhead. So now that we've added hosts to each group, let's go ahead and add variables to each group. Each group being the routers group and the switches group. So if we want to add variables at the group level, we can just say vars, and then right here is where we can set our group level variables. So we'll go ahead and we will move this variable up here. And now we can get rid of that management interface variable for each one of the individual routers. Okay. So again, routers is a child of the all group. Routers has a host list of router 1 and router 2. And we're assigning variables to it as well. We're assigning that management interface variable. So now let's do the same thing for switches. We'll say vars, and then management int is VLAN 1000, and then let's get rid of it on the actual switches. Cool. So this should be all we need. In our playbook, we can still target the all group, but now we should be able to still debug that management interface variable. So we'll go ahead and run our playbook again. And as you can see, we got the exact same results. But now we have less lines in our inventory. And now if we wanted to add another device to each one of these groups, we could do so without having to specify or define that management interface variable for each new device. So we'll say we'll add another host to the routers group, and we'll just call it dummy1. And we'll do the same thing to the switches group. We'll call it dummy2. Cool. And if we run our playbook again, as you can see, dummy1 has loopback 0 and dummy2 has VLAN 1000. It's now we're going to go over what's called variable precedence. So when it comes to variables, if let's say for example that we also applied the management interface variable at the host level. So let's say for router 1, actually before I go any further, I'm going to get rid of dummy1 and dummy2. But let's say that for router 1, we specified that same variable, so management int, and let's say we set it to gi1. Okay. When it comes to variable precedence, right, if two variables, or excuse me, if the same variable exists in multiple areas in the inventory, the most specific instance will win. So in this case, since we're defining management interface underneath router 1, that makes it a host level variable, which means that even if we define it at the group level, for router 1, when tasks are run against router 1, its host level variable will take precedence over loopback 0. Router 2 will still use the variable defined at the group level because we haven't defined anything at the host level, right? So if we go ahead and run our playbook again, we should see that for router 1, it should say gi1. And that's exactly what happened. Router 1 is set to gi1. So again, when it comes to variable precedence, specificity matters, right? So furthermore, if we go up to the all group, and let's give all some variables. So we'll say vars, and we'll say management int, and let's say sort of as a default, right? Unless the management interface is defined farther down in the tree, let's give it a default value. So we'll just say unknown, right? So now any device that doesn't have a management interface set for it will use the management interface variable set at the all group level. So let's get rid of that variable for the switches group. And now since we don't have this management interface variable defined for switches or at the individual host level, they should default to unknown, whereas the routers should retain loopback 0 or gi1. Cool. So switch 1 says unknown, and switch 2 also says unknown. So that's really the basics of managing a static inventory in YAML. Again, there are other file formats that you can use, and they will look slightly different, but at the end of the day, the core concepts still stay the same. So you can have nested groups, so groups within other groups, and each group can only have three things. We can have hosts that are directly tied to the group, we can have variables tied to the group, or we can have those nested child groups. And then if we set variables at multiple spots in the inventory, the most specific wins. And that's really all there is to it, so thanks for watching.